a kind of Greek stamp of 500 BC and of archaic impersonality. Whereas this sarcophagus portrait, though Italian in realism, is 4th century in awareness, like the latest paintings near the present graveyard under the hummocked wheat fields of Tarquinia. This is the private responsibility with which Rome began, and for which it had to frame a universal law and moral discipline. We yield to the temptation of beauty, though there is disagreement about the Lady of Elche's date, to hint that the conscious and sensuous ripening was Mediterranean, and that after 400 BC, or for a guess 3rd century, it was felt also in Greco-Punic Spain. Though to sense how Rome could enlist that inwardness which had become the liability of Greece, a direct contrast will be most instructive, and from the very time that Polybius undertook to account for the Greek decline and Roman rise, set the idealized rapture and refined yearning of the Praxitelean and Alexandrian, its worlds to conquer turning into dream, as Alcibiades did, and even Alexander's, against the equal self-awareness of the so-called elder Brutus, who expelled the kings and left his example like an injunction to his namesake, but an awareness energized and disciplined by will. For the wistful impulse of the Greek, the reality of control, there lies the secret of the plodding, slow, inexorable march of Rome. Thus Hegel, in one of his most powerful distinctions, the Roman state is not a repetition of such a state of individuals as the Athenian polis was. The geniality and joy of soul that existed there have given place to harsh and rigorous toil. Everywhere in the art record of that responsibility we read the crushing destiny, for which the world, as Hegel also says, was sunk in melancholy, so that even today we cannot walk the portrait halls of a Roman museum without being bowed by that burden of loss and heaviness, as if we too had to pay for the formative struggle which lay like a pall upon the human spirit. Under that brooding, the question becomes imperative. Rigorous toil, for what end? The search for origins gave us brazen warriors. Titus' triumphal arch on the Forum celebrates the sack of Jerusalem. The Jews led in chains, the 7-branched candelabra among the spoils. Does the guidance of Jove, Aeneas, Jovis Monitis, reduce to a doggedness of military conquest, of which the facade is Araparchus, the altar of peace, heavy virtues extolled without the vibrance or intellect of Greece? From the wolf origins praised from Livy down, hide-bound severity and outward fierceness, killjoy Marcus Cato, censor, whose morals did not preclude avarice, crying for the destruction of Carthage at every meeting of the Senate, delenda est Carthago, murderous Marius, boasting of ignorance. I never studied Greek, I never wanted to. What I learned was more for my country's good, to strike the enemy, stand close guard, bear hunger, heat, and cold, sleep on the ground, fear nothing but a coward's fame. Even to this 3rd century A.D. Ludovisi sarcophagus, with the battle between Romans and barbarians, the central theme of the togaed race in life and art is war. Of course, peace is intended, peace and law, all the virtues which Caesar in Shaw calls Rome's gifts to the world in exchange for a few ornaments. There is the good Emperor Trajan of the adoptive line, whose happy rule Gibbon so praised. But observe his most conspicuous monument, the column with its 650-foot-long coiled frieze of the Dacian campaigns. How it falls together over a gap of a century and a half with Caesar's account of the Gallic wars. The 9th and 10th legions drove the Atrebates from the high ground to the river, and when they attempted to cross, pressed after them sword in hand, and killed a great many, crossing and pushing on, though the slope was against them. But the enemy, even in their despair, displayed such heroic courage that when their foremost ranks had fallen, the next mounted upon their prostrate comrades and fought standing on their bodies. The battle was over, and the Nervian people, nay, their very name, was brought to the verge of extinction. Even Marcus Aurelius, philosopher, is commemorated by such a column, to a detail of which we have shifted while reading Caesar. That was most of his life, laboring and fighting in a last Roman effort to extend, hold, and consolidate. Without those notes in his book of somber meditations, this among the Quadi on the Danube, the soldiers, while he wrote, executing prisoners perhaps, or burning villages, who would have tied the scenes of the column to those Greek expressions of the Stoic ideal, to keep the divine genius within, pure and unwronged, Lord of all pleasures and pains. Though the face of the equestrian Marcus speaks more, that bronze work preserved through the Dark Ages because the Christians thought it Constantine and on their side. Those lonely Aurelian eyes are not at all like Constantine's eyes of staring dogma, yet they are barometric signs of something that was working in the Christian's favor. Wilt thou then, O my soul, ever at last be good and simple and single and naked, showing thyself more visible than the body that overlies thee, ever be fulfilled and self-sufficing, longing for nothing? As if there were two persons representing two Romes, the outward a public power, itself a wedded pair of war and law, and the inner of these shadowy musings. That separation of outward and inward, body and spirit, is the melancholy which pervades the late classical, and buttressed against it, never denying it, the Roman and Stoic command, be like a headland of rock, on which the waves break incessantly, but it stands fast, and around it the seething of the waters sinks to rest. Under the titanic vaults of Rome, such depths were forming. For Virgil, the romantic transformation of the Odyssey yields to the God-given task of rule. For Hegel, the compulsion of rule foments inwardness. The world is sunk in melancholy, and it is all over with the natural side of spirit, yet only from this could arise the supersensuous, the free spirit in Christianity. Early Rome was a force in the world, but it was not yet world historical. It deepens to that when the rather plain humanity of the Latin citizen of the Republic, a now legally defined private person, becomes in the accession of empire and of Alexandrian consciousness the focus of a double crisis, the class and power struggle of the civil wars, and the temptation of luxury and the softening arts. Marvelous arts at their best, and it would seem quite above politics, though the strictures would apply to Sybaritic Pompeii as to Aeneas lapped in Dido's arms, heedless of empire, by base love enthralled. Yet the Villa of Mysteries is as startling a height of Greek art on Italian soil as Lucretius' Epicurean poem. The parallel is instructive, though they seem opposite at first, Lucretius denying these gods, these mysteries, while he celebrates a super-mystery of atomic nature ruled by love, the alma genitrix invoked as te dea. We are all sprung from heavenly seed, all have the same Father, by whom Mother Earth conceives and bears goodly crops, and joyous trees, and the race of men. A thing, therefore, never returns to nothing. Rains die when Father Ether has tumbled them into the lap of Mother Earth, but then goodly crops spring up, and trees laden with fruit, and the leafy forests ring on all sides with the song of new birds. Though like all expressions of post-Euripidean soul, the Villa of Mysteries and the De Rerum Naturae betray the loneliness and torment at the heart of things, as when Lucretius writes of the frenzy of love. They pine away by a hidden wound, at a loss to know what they really desire. Feasts are set out, perfumes, crowns, and garlands, all in vain, since from the very fountain of delight a bitter drop wells up to pain amid the flowers. Fitting St. Jerome should record of Lucretius how factually no one knows, driven mad by a love potion, after he had written in the intervals of his insanity a number of books, he killed himself by his own hand in his 44th year. The despair of reason might almost have been potion enough. If the Boston Museum bust is of 50 BC as claimed, it shows us an aesthetic patrician who has lived through the troubles of Lucretius' time, while men amass wealth by civil bloodshed and greedily double their riches, piling up murder on murder. Those eyes could have seen the Forum massacre of 10,000 men gathered to protest Sulla's corn laws, Spartacus' slave war, put down after 2 years, 71 BC, with like violence, 5,000 fugitives killed by Pompey, 6,000 slaves crucified along the road from Rome to Capua. Perhaps, like Cicero's refined friend Atticus, he took the philosophic way of withdrawal from the state, regretted by Plato and praised by Lucretius, in the image of looking from land to a navy distressed at sea. To hold the lofty and serene positions, well fortified by the learning of the wise, from which you may look down on others wandering abroad and going astray, the rivalry of birth, the struggle night and day to reach the summit of power and be masters of the world. It was only in that Rome, glutting itself on the spoils of the Hellenic East, not wealth only, but the doubts and sophistications, the sensational vulgarities and refinements of art, the city, as Sallust said, become a sink, into which there poured all who were in any place notorious for crime or vice. It was then, in war and successive purges, in the corruption and breakdown of republican institutions, that great personalities arise, Cato, Pompey, Cicero, Caesar, Agrippa, called forth by the imperatives of a threatened world. Now the portrait bust, Rome's chief contribution to classical art, becomes a record, not merely of the warts and wrinkles, but through that surface of momentous needs and changes in the soul. Let this type of eroded and embattled Roman rigor stand for Cato, inflexible as he. But it must reach beyond itself to catch those last hours as told by Plutarch. I do not mean against the sweetness of Socrates talking and falling asleep in the shade of his hemlock, Cato's bungling suicide, so that he had to drag his guts out and tear them with his hands, but rather what won him a place in Dante's theology, that he advised his son to withdraw from politics, and so passed his last evening reading Plato on immortality. That was in 46 BC. Caesar had just prevailed over Pompey. Cicero's letters are our best window into Roman failure, where the official portrait shows his other side, the public front of success devoted to the higher aim, as his rhetoric sounds the obligation of Plato